Forget everything you thought you knew about Roman parties. We're about to pull back the velvet curtains and expose the unsettling realities of their most legendary festivals. Prepare to see the true face of ancient Roman excess, far beyond the glamorous myths. Welcome. Let your thoughts settle. Let the concerns of the day drift away as we step back through the centuries into the ancient world of Rome. Tonight, we journey beyond the polished marble and triumphal arches you might imagine, beyond the romantic notion of togas and laurel wreaths. We're going to explore something quieter, something often left in shadow when we speak of Roman grandeur. You've likely heard of Roman festivals. Perhaps you've imagined the Saturnalia with its gift-giving and temporary reversals of social order, or the Lupercalia with its strange fertility rites. Maybe you've pictured the games, the spectacles in the Colosseum, the roar of crowds celebrating their gods and emperors. These were indeed moments of communal celebration, of religious devotion, of shared Roman identity. But imagine yourself standing not at the center of the festivities, not among the senators in their fine seats, but at the edges, in the narrow alleyways where the lamplight doesn't quite reach. Among the faces of those who served the wine but never drank it freely, among those who cleaned the streets after the revelry ended. There, in those margins, the festivals wore a different face entirely. Tonight, we unveil what lurked beneath the spectacle, the excess that became grotesque, the celebration that required suffering, the joy purchased with the labor and pain of those Rome preferred to forget. This is not a story of villains and heroes, but of a civilization whose grandest moments contained within them the seeds of their own darkness. Let yourself sink into the cushions. Close your eyes if you wish. We have all the time we need to explore these shadows, to understand them, and perhaps to see echoes of them in the world around us still. The past is patient. It waits for us to listen. Let us begin. The Roman calendar was crowded with festivals. More than 100 days each year were marked as feriae, holy days dedicated to various gods, goddesses, and the spirits that Romans believed animated every aspect of their world. Some were intimate family affairs, conducted at household shrines with offerings of wine and honey cakes. Others transformed the entire city into a theater of devotion and display. Imagine yourself in Rome during the Republic, perhaps in the 2nd century before the Common Era. The city is growing, swelling with the wealth of conquest. Silver flows in from the mines of Spain. Grain ships arrive from Sicily and North Africa. The old festivals of farmers and shepherds are being transformed into something grander, something that reflects Rome's new position as mistress of the Mediterranean. Take the Ludi Romani, the Roman Games, held each September in honor of Jupiter. Originally, these might have been simple chariot races and athletic contests, but by the Middle Republic they had expanded into multi-day spectacles. The Senate allocated enormous sums from the public treasury. Wealthy magistrates, seeking popular favor, added their own fortunes to make the games more lavish, more memorable. The displays became competitions among the elite, each trying to outdo the predecessor's generosity. The procession that opened the games wound through the city streets. Musicians played. Dancers moved in practiced formations. Animals sacred to various gods were led toward the altars. Behind them came the magistrates themselves, dressed in togas so white they seemed to glow in the Mediterranean sun, their faces painted red in imitation of Jupiter's statue, riding in chariots as if they themselves were gods descending to earth. The crowds lined the streets. They cheered. They called out the names of favored politicians. They watched the parade of Rome's power and plenty. And in this watching, in this participation, they were reminded of their place in the divine order. Jupiter loved Rome. Jupiter granted Rome victory. Jupiter, through his earthly representatives, provided these gifts of entertainment and abundance. but let your mind drift now to the mechanics of such spectacle. Consider the preparatory work that made these displays possible. Months before the festival, officials would have been planning, negotiating, purchasing. The animals for sacrifice had to be acquired, the finest specimens Rome's markets could provide. White bulls for Jupiter, goats for Mars, sheep for various household deities. These creatures were valuable, each representing significant expenditure. The animals were transported to the city, kept in pens near the forum. They needed to be fed, watered, tended. This work fell to slaves and hired laborers, men whose names we will never know, whose labor made the sacred possible, but who received little recognition for it. In the days before the festival, these workers rose before dawn. They hauled water from the Tiber. They carried fodder. They cleaned the filth that accumulated wherever animals were penned. On the day of sacrifice, the animals were led to the altars. The priests performed the rituals with practiced precision. The knife fell, the blood poured into sacred vessels or onto the altar stones. The carcasses were butchered, portions burned for the gods, the rest distributed for the feast that would follow. Here we encounter the first shadows. The sheer scale of slaughter during major festivals was immense. For the opening of the Ludi Romani, dozens of animals might be sacrificed in a single day, their blood soaked into the earth. The smell of burning flesh and viscera hung over the city. What we might find disturbing, Romans considered holy. The gods required blood. Sacrifice was the mechanism by which divine favor was maintained. But consider the workers who performed this labor, the men who held the struggling animals, the butchers who carved the carcasses, the slaves who carried away the offal and waste, the tanners who would later process the hides. These were not participants in the sacred drama as the priests were. They were the infrastructure, the hidden labor force whose work was necessary but largely invisible to those celebrating in the forums and temples. The meat from sacrifices fed the city. At major festivals, the distribution of meat was a form of public charity, a way for the state and wealthy sponsors to demonstrate generosity. Long lines formed. Citizens waited their turn. Slaves and servants held baskets to carry their masters' portions. The smell of roasting meat filled the air. This was abundance, yes. This was the state providing for its people. But imagine yourself in that crowd, jostling for position, the press of bodies, the heat of the day, the irritation of waiting. Not everyone received an equal share. Citizens of the higher classes sent slaves to collect their portions, avoiding the crush entirely. Freedmen and the urban poor fought for whatever remained. Foreigners and slaves, unless they served citizens, received nothing at all. The games themselves followed the religious ceremonies. Chariot races thundered around the Circus Maximus. The great oval track could hold perhaps 150,000 spectators. Some scholars estimate even more. The seats were divided by social class. Senators sat closest to the track, in marble seats with cushions. Knights occupied the next section. Ordinary citizens filled the wooden benches above. Slaves and non-citizens stood or squeezed into whatever spaces remained. The charioteers were celebrities, their names and victories recorded, their images reproduced on oil lamps and mosaics. They raced for different factions, identified by colors: red, white, blue, green. Romans bet enormous sums on these races. Fortunes changed hands. Riots sometimes erupted when outcomes were disputed or when fans of rival factions clashed. But the charioteers themselves were often slaves or freedmen, men from the lower orders of society who risked death each time they raced. The chariots were light, unstable, designed for speed rather than safety. The horses were powerful, barely controlled. Crashes were common, sometimes spectacular. The crowd roared at these shipwrecks, as they called them. Broken chariots, tangled reins, horses dragging injured drivers around the track because the driver couldn't cut himself free. Some charioteers survived long enough to win their freedom and wealth. Most did not. Their bodies were buried in the cheap graves beyond the city walls, forgotten except by those who had bet on them and lost. This pattern repeated across different festivals. The Ludi Plebei, the plebeian games, held in November. The Ludi Apollinaris in July, established during the dark days of the Second Punic War, when Hannibal's army ravaged Italy and Rome, desperately sought Apollo's favor. The Ludi Megalenses in April, honoring the great mother goddess Cybele, whose worship the Senate had imported from Asia Minor. Each festival brought similar elements. Processions displaying wealth and piety, sacrifices feeding the gods and the people, games entertaining the masses, and beneath it all, the labor of thousands whose participation was compulsory, whose bodies made the spectacle possible, whose suffering was deemed acceptable because it served the greater glory of Rome and her gods. The festivals also marked time in the Roman year. They punctuated the rhythm of agricultural work, military campaigning, legal business. During festival days, the courts closed, normal commerce paused. The city transformed itself into a sacred space where the boundary between divine and human thinned. But this transformation was not universal. For a wealthy senator, a festival might mean a day of leisure, of watching games from a comfortable seat, of dining on sacrificial meat prepared by his kitchen slaves, of perhaps hosting friends for conversation and wine. For his slaves, a festival meant different labor, not rest. The household still needed to function. Meals still needed to be prepared. Water still needed to be carried. The senators' leisure required their work. In the countryside, the rhythm of agricultural labor continued regardless of urban festivals. Harvest could not wait. Olives needed to be pressed. Grapes required harvesting. The great estates, the latifundia worked by chain gangs of slaves, did not pause their operations because Rome celebrated Jupiter. The festivals belonged primarily to the city, to those who could afford to participate in them, to those whose social standing entitled them to seats at the games and portions of sacrificial meat. Consider, too, the women of Rome, whose participation in festivals was complex and constrained. Certain rituals belonged exclusively to women. The Bonadea ceremony, held in December, excluded all men. The Vestal virgins played crucial roles in maintaining Rome's sacred fires and performing specific sacrifices. But in the great public spectacles, women were largely spectators. They watched from separate sections in the circus. They participated in processions, but did not lead them. Their religious roles, though important, were carefully circumscribed by male authority. The festivals created opportunities for social mixing that daily life otherwise restricted. In the packed crowds of the Circus Maximus, bodies pressed together regardless of class. Young men found opportunities to speak to young women. Pickpockets worked the crowds. Wine vendors moved through the stands. The sheer density of humanity created a temporary suspension of normal social distances, though the hierarchies remained, marked by where one sat and how one dressed. These moments of mixing, of temporary loosening of social bounds, served a purpose. They allowed the lower classes a glimpse of grandeur, a participation in Roman power and prosperity. The games were free, the meat was distributed, the spectacle was shared, and in this sharing, the state purchased loyalty and quiescence. The plebeians might live in crowded tenements and work exhausting jobs, but they were still Romans. They still belonged to the greatest city in the world. The festivals reminded them of this identity, reinforced it, made it tangible and real. Yet even this inclusivity had its limits. The foreigners who crowded into Rome, attracted by the opportunities of the growing empire, found themselves excluded from the festival's benefits. They might watch the processions from the street. They might smell the roasting meat, but the distributions were for citizens. The privileges of participation belonged to those with legal standing. Rome's generosity extended only to Romans. The religious meaning of these festivals was genuine. Romans believed in their gods with a conviction we might struggle to understand. The proper performance of rituals protected the state. Errors in ceremony required the entire ritual to be repeated. The gods were real, present, demanding. They required appeasement and honor. The festivals were not mere entertainments, but essential maintenance of the covenant between Rome and the divine powers that had granted her dominion. But belief coexisted with political utility. The festivals were tools of social control, mechanisms by which the elite maintained their position and the state channeled potentially dangerous energies into sanctioned forms. The poor could not revolt if they were watching chariot races. The hungry could not riot if they were being fed sacrificial meat. The spectacle dazzled and distracted and bound the populace to the existing order. As Rome grew, as the Republic gave way to empire, the festivals grew with it. Augustus, the first emperor, understood their power. He restored ancient festivals that had fallen into neglect. He added new ones, celebrating his family and his victories. The imperial cult, the worship of deceased emperors as gods, inserted itself into the festival calendar. What had been rituals honoring Jupiter and Mars became occasions for celebrating the emperor's divinity and Rome's eternal destiny under imperial rule. The size of spectacles increased. When the Colosseum opened in 80 CE under the Emperor Titus, the celebrations lasted 100 days. Thousands of animals died. Thousands of gladiators fought. The new amphitheater became the permanent home for spectacles that had previously taken place in temporary wooden structures. The games became more elaborate, more expensive, more deadly. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay a while longer with the earlier festivals, with the simpler time before the empire's full excesses. Let us notice the patterns that were already present, the structures of inequality and exploitation that the grand spectacle both revealed and concealed. The night after a festival, the city's workers emerged. They swept the streets, they hauled away the refuse, they cleared the ashes from altars, they scrubbed blood from stones. By dawn, when Romans emerged from their homes, the visible evidence of the previous day's celebration would be mostly erased, leaving only memories and the anticipation of the next festival. This work was invisible, performed in darkness by those whose labor society deemed beneath notice. Yet without them, the festivals could not have occurred. The spectacle required infrastructure. The sacred required maintenance. The celebration depended on those who cleaned up after it. And so we begin to see the shadow side. The festivals that brought joy to some required the suffering of others. The religious devotion was real, but so was the political manipulation. The spectacle was grand, but its foundation was the exploitation of those without power. Rome celebrated its greatness by consuming resources and lives at a scale that should give us pause, even across the centuries that separate us from them. Let yourself rest with these images. The white-clad magistrate in his chariot, the slave hauling water before dawn, the roar of the crowd, the silent work in darkness. Hold both realities together. This is the complexity of history. This is what lies beneath the surface when we look carefully at the past. The Roman appetite for excess during festivals was not metaphorical. It was literal, measurable, visible in the quantities of food and drink consumed, in the waste that accumulated, in the bodies that suffered the consequences of overindulgence. Consider the banquet, that central feature of Roman festival celebration. For the wealthy, festivals provided excuse and opportunity for feasting on a scale that exceeded even their usual luxurious standards. The triclinium, the formal dining room, became a theater where wealth performed itself through consumption. Imagine yourself reclining on a couch, propped on your left elbow in the Roman manner, reaching with your right hand toward the low table laden with dishes. But multiply this image. A wealthy Roman hosting a festival banquet might invite dozens of guests, each reclining in order of social precedence. The host occupied the position of honor. His most important clients and friends took the places nearest him. Those of lesser status reclined farther from the center of attention. The food arrived in waves. First courses of eggs, olives, lettuce dressed with oil and vinegar, oysters brought in barrels of seawater from the coast. Dormice fattened in special jars and roasted with honey and poppy seeds, a delicacy that seems strange to modern sensibilities, but that Romans prized. Then came fish, elaborately prepared. Mullet was particularly valued. The Romans bred them in artificial ponds and paid enormous sums for specimens of exceptional size. Eels from the Strait of Messina. Lamprey, that ugly creature that Roman gourmands adored. The main courses followed. Whole roasted pigs, peacocks refeathered after cooking to present them in their full display. Flamingos, their tongues considered the choicest part. Exotic game from the far reaches of the empire. Boar from the forests of Gaul, antelope from Africa. During particularly lavish festivals, hosts competed to present the most unusual dishes, the rarest ingredients, the most impressive presentations. Between courses, slaves appeared with silver bowls of warm water and towels. The diners washed their hands, sticky with food eaten with fingers. The slaves withdrew, then returned with the next wave of dishes. The rhythm of the feast continued, course after course, hour after hour. But here is where the shadow deepens. The Romans had developed a reputation, whether entirely deserved or somewhat exaggerated by later moralists, for inducing vomiting during feasts to make room for more food. The vomitorium, despite what the name suggests to modern ears, was actually an architectural feature, a passage in amphitheaters through which crowds could exit. But the association with purging oneself to continue eating stuck in the cultural imagination because the practice itself occurred. The slave who carried the basin, who waited while his master emptied his stomach, who cleaned up the result, performed this service with the same detached efficiency required for all his duties. His disgust, if he felt any, could not be shown. His labor made his master's excess possible. The quantities of food wasted at these banquets exceeded what entire families in Rome's tenements might eat in months. Dishes were tasted, found not quite perfect, sent back. Courses were left half-eaten. The Romans did not have refrigeration. The leftover food could be distributed to slaves and clients, but much of it simply spoiled, particularly in the heat of summer festivals. The waste was casual, unremarked, a natural consequence of abundance. Wine flowed as freely as food. Romans mixed their wine with water, considering the undiluted drink barbarous, fit only for those who had not learned civilization. But the quantity consumed, even diluted, was substantial. Amphorae of wine were opened, poured, refilled. The slaves who served the wine were carefully chosen for grace and appearance. Young, attractive slaves, male and female, moved through the dining room, pouring from heavy vessels, their presence decorative as well as functional. As the night progressed and the wine accumulated in the diners' veins, inhibitions loosened. Conversations grew louder, laughter became raucous. The careful social performances of the feast's beginning gave way to something more primal. Sexual propositions were made, sometimes subtly, sometimes with crude directness. The boundaries that normally separated master from slave, that protected even slaves from the most egregious violations, thinned during these festivals of excess. The serving slaves could not refuse advances without risking punishment. Their bodies, like their labor, belonged to their masters. The law provided them no protection in this matter. The feast that celebrated Roman prosperity and divine favor became, for some of those who served it, an ordeal of endurance, a trial to be survived. Let your mind drift now to the streets outside these private banquets, to the public celebrations where wine was distributed free to the crowds. The state, during major festivals, sometimes provided wine from the public treasury. Wealthy sponsors added their own contributions. The fountains on occasion literally ran with wine instead of water. The generosity was real. For poor Romans who usually drank cheap wine mixed heavily with water, or who could afford wine only rarely, these festival distributions represented genuine abundance. They drank freely, gratefully. The wine warmed them, lifted their spirits, dissolved the grinding anxiety of poverty for a few precious hours. But public drunkenness on a mass scale brought its own problems. The narrow streets of Rome filled with crowds of inebriated celebrants. Fights broke out over perceived slights, over rivalry between factions in the chariot races, over nothing at all. The city's small force of watchmen, the vigiles, struggled to maintain order. They broke up brawls. They hauled the most disorderly to temporary custody, but their numbers were insufficient to police the entire city during these festivals of excess. Crimes increased during festival periods. Pickpockets worked the drunken crowds. Burglars took advantage of households where the masters were out celebrating and the slaves had been given wine. Assaults occurred in dark alleyways. The morning after a major festival revealed not just the physical detritus of celebration, but human wreckage as well. Bodies with unexplained injuries. Women who had been violated, slaves who had been beaten for failures real or imagined during the chaos of the previous night. The cleanup, again, fell to those at the bottom of society's hierarchy. The aediles, the magistrates responsible for public order and the city's infrastructure, organized teams of public slaves to clear the streets. They hauled away broken pottery, spoiled food, the vomit and urine that accumulated wherever crowds gathered. They scrubbed the paving stones. They opened the sewers to flush away the accumulated filth. This labor was necessary, unglamorous, and largely invisible to those who had celebrated. When the wealthy emerged from their homes the day after a festival, they expected clean streets. The mechanism by which that cleanliness was achieved concerned them not at all. The exploitation extended beyond Rome itself. The food that filled the festival tables, the wine that flowed through the streets, came from somewhere. The grain that fed Rome was extracted as tribute from Egypt, Sicily, North Africa. The ships that carried it sailed in convoys, escorted by warships to protect against pirates. But the loading and unloading of those ships required labor, sweating labor in the Mediterranean heat. In the grain fields of Egypt, workers labored under the overseer's eye, harvesting the wheat that would feed Roman festivals. Some were free peasants, paying their taxes in kind. Others were slaves, working land owned by wealthy Romans who had never seen Egypt, but who collected its wealth regardless. The harvest had to meet quotas. Shortfalls meant punishment. The system extracted maximum production with minimal regard for those performing the extraction. The wine came from vineyards across the empire. In Italy, in southern Gaul, in Spain, slaves tended the vines, pruned them, harvested the grapes. The work was seasonal, intensifying during harvest time when speed was essential. The grapes had to be picked at the right moment, pressed immediately, the wine processed and stored in amphorae for transport. The slaves worked long days, sleeping in barracks, eating simple food, forbidden to taste the product of their labor, except as the dregs left in the pressing vats. The animals sacrificed at festivals, the cattle and pigs and sheep, were raised on ranches and farms throughout Italy and the provinces. The large herds required to supply Rome's appetite for sacrifice and feast represented enormous capital investment. The herders who tended these animals were often slaves, living rough lives in the countryside, moving with the herds, isolated from urban society. When the animals arrived in Rome for festivals, they had often been driven for days along the roads. They arrived exhausted, sometimes injured. The men who drove them were not much better off. The life of an itinerant drover was hard, dangerous, and poorly compensated. Yet this system of rural labor and animal husbandry made urban festivals possible. The city consumed what the countryside produced, and the relationship was extractive, flowing one direction. The festivals also required other goods. The crowns of flowers worn by priests and sacrificial animals, the incense burned at altars, the oil for lamps, the fabric for decorations. Each item represented a chain of labor, often performed by slaves or the desperately poor, that terminated in the moment of festival display and consumption. Consider the flower sellers who supplied garlands for festivals. They or their slaves gathered flowers from gardens and wild places around Rome. They wove them into crowns and garlands through the night before a festival, their fingers stained with pollen and sap. They sold their wares in the forum, competing with other vendors, earning small sums that barely covered their costs. The flowers would wilt within a day, their beauty and purpose ephemeral, but the labor of creating them was real and exhausting. The incense came from far away, frankincense and myrrh from Arabia and the Horn of Africa. The trade routes that brought these precious resins to Rome were dangerous. Caravans crossed deserts, ships sailed the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Pirates and bandits threatened. The merchants who organized this trade became wealthy, but the men who actually transported the goods, who loaded and unloaded ships, who drove the camel trains, lived hard lives on the margins of survival. In Rome, the incense was burned freely at festivals. The smoke rose from 100 altars, carrying prayers to the gods. The smell was heavy, sweet, sacred. But each grain of resin represented a chain of human effort stretching thousands of miles, a network of exploitation and labor that made Roman piety materially possible. The scale of consumption during festivals was, by ancient standards, extraordinary. A single major festival might consume resources equivalent to what smaller cities used in a year. The concentration of wealth and goods in Rome, extracted from an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, allowed for spectacles of abundance that both reflected and reinforced Roman power. But this abundance was unevenly distributed. The senators and equestrians feasted on delicacies. The plebeians received portions of sacrificial meat and free wine. The slaves received scraps, if anything. The structural inequality of Roman society was visible in microcosm at every festival feast, in every distribution of food, in every seating arrangement at the games. The poor of Rome, the free citizens who lived in the insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that crowded the city, had complicated relationships with these festivals. On one hand, the festivals provided real benefits. The food distributions helped stretch meager budgets. The free entertainment filled days that might otherwise have been spent in idleness and worry. The festivals reminded even the poorest citizen that they belonged to Rome, that they shared in her glory. On the other hand, the festivals made visible the vast gap between rich and poor. The senator in his cushioned seat, the poor citizen standing in the upper reaches of the Circus Maximus, the lavish private banquet, the portion of plain roasted meat from a public distribution. The festival both included and excluded, both gave and withheld, both celebrated community and marked hierarchy. Some Romans recognized the problem. Moralists criticized the excess. Philosophers like Seneca wrote about the foolishness of overindulgence, the spiritual emptiness of material consumption. But their critiques rarely extended to the system that made such excess possible. They blamed individuals for lack of self-control, rather than questioning whether a society built on slavery and extraction might inevitably produce such inequality. The festivals continued year after year, generation after generation. They became more elaborate under the empire as the emperors competed to demonstrate their generosity and cement their legitimacy. The costs increased, the waste accumulated, the exploitation deepened. Yet the festivals also provided moments of genuine joy for those who participated in them. The child who tasted roasted meat for one of the few times that year. The couple who met in the crowds at the circus and began a courtship. the family that gathered to celebrate together. These moments of happiness were real, even though the system that produced them was exploitative. This is the complexity we must hold. The festivals were not simply tools of oppression, though they functioned as such. They were not merely wasteful excess, though waste was inherent in them. They were moments when Roman society performed itself, displayed its values, enacted its relationship with the divine. And in that performance, both the grandeur and the darkness were visible to those willing to look carefully. The dawn after a festival revealed the cost. The streets littered with the debris of celebration, the slaves exhausted from serving through the night, the animals slaughtered, the resources consumed, the vulnerable exploited. But it also revealed the resilience of those at the bottom of society's hierarchy. They survived, they cleaned up, they prepared for the next day's labor. They endured. Let that image settle. The servant carrying away the evidence of his master's excess. The street cleaner scrubbing blood from stones. The woman who served wine all night to drunken guests, finally lying down to sleep. These people made Roman festivals possible. Without them, the spectacle could not have occurred. Yet history rarely remembers their names or honors their contribution. We remember the emperors who sponsored the games. We remember the dates of great festivals. We remember the buildings where they occurred. But the human infrastructure, the thousands upon thousands of anonymous laborers whose bodies and work sustained Roman celebration, they fade into the background of history as they were meant to fade into the background of Roman consciousness. This forgetting was not accidental. It was structural. Roman society required that slaves and the poor remain largely invisible except when performing their functions. The festivals, for all their supposed inclusivity, reinforced this invisibility even as they temporarily elevated the poor to the status of recipients of public generosity. The cycle repeated. Festival, excess, cleanup, ordinary life, then festival again. The rhythm of the Roman year, marked by celebration and consumption, by religious devotion and political calculation, by genuine joy and systematic exploitation. This was Rome. This was the reality beneath the spectacle. Rest now with these images. Let them settle into your consciousness without judgment. History does not offer us simple moral lessons. It offers us complexity, contradiction, the troubling reality that great civilizations were built on foundations we would find unacceptable. The festivals celebrated gods and empire. They also celebrated inequality and normalized the suffering of those without power. Both realities coexisted. Both were true. This is what we mean when we speak of the dark side of Roman festivals. Not that they were entirely dark, but that the darkness was there, integral to the light, inseparable from the spectacle we so often admire from our distant vantage point. The amphitheater stood as the ultimate expression of Roman festival culture, a monument to spectacle built in stone and blood. When we think of Roman festivals now, these structures dominate our imagination. The Colosseum, that great oval of travertine and concrete, looms over our conception of Roman entertainment. But the violence it housed was not an aberration. It was central to Roman religious and civic life, woven into the fabric of festival celebration. Let us approach this carefully, calmly. The violence was real. People died. Animals suffered and perished in enormous numbers. But to understand why Romans incorporated such brutality into their sacred celebrations, we must resist the temptation to simply condemn. We must try to see through their eyes, even as we acknowledge that what they accepted we find disturbing. The gladiatorial games began as funeral rites. In the 3rd century, before the Common Era, wealthy Romans honored their deceased relatives by having captives or slaves fight to the death at the graveside. The blood spilled was an offering to the dead, a sacrifice that paralleled the animal sacrifices offered to the gods. 3 pairs of fighters at the first recorded gladiatorial display, a small private affair, a family marking grief and status through ritualized violence. But the games grew. What started as funeral commemoration became public entertainment. Magistrates discovered that sponsoring gladiatorial combats won them political support. The crowds loved the spectacle. They remembered the politicians who provided it. The games became larger, more frequent, incorporated into the festival calendar. By the late Republic, gladiatorial shows had become spectacular affairs. Julius Caesar, during his time as aedile, sponsored games featuring hundreds of pairs of fighters. The displays bankrupted him temporarily, but secured his popularity with the Roman masses. The political utility of the games was undeniable. The people who controlled the spectacle controlled public favor. Imagine yourself in the stands of an amphitheater on a festival day. The structure rises around you, tier upon tier of seating. Perhaps 50,000 people gathered to watch. The murmur of conversation fills the air. Vendors move through the crowd selling snacks and drinks. Children run in the aisles. The atmosphere is festive, anticipatory, not unlike a modern sporting event. The morning begins with animal displays and hunts. The venaciones, as they were called, brought exotic beasts from across the empire to die in the arena. Lions from North Africa, bears from the forests of Germania, elephants from beyond the desert, leopards, crocodiles, ostriches, creatures most Romans would never otherwise see. The animals were symbols of Roman dominion, of an empire so vast it could bring the world's wildness to a single arena and dominate it. The hunters, the venatores, entered the arena with spears and nets. They were professionals, trained in techniques of animal combat. Some specialized in particular species. The best became famous, their names known throughout the city. But the work was dangerous. Animals cornered and terrified fought desperately. Claws ripped flesh, tusks gored. The medical knowledge to treat such injuries was limited. Infection claimed many who survived the initial wounds. The scale of animal killing during major festivals beggars modern comprehension. When the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, the celebrations lasted 100 days. Ancient sources claim that 9,000 animals died during those spectacles. Even if we allow for exaggeration in those numbers, the actual toll was surely in the thousands. The logistics of capturing, transporting, and housing such numbers of wild animals represented an enormous undertaking. Consider the capture operations. In North Africa, teams of hunters tracked lions, constructed traps, subdued the animals without killing them. The lions had to survive transport to Rome. They were caged, loaded onto ships, sailed across the Mediterranean. Many died during transport from stress, injury, or inadequate care. Those that survived arrived at facilities outside Rome where they were kept until needed for the games. The men who cared for these captive animals worked dangerous jobs. A moment of inattention around a caged lion could be fatal. The animals were unpredictable, stressed, often injured. They had to be fed substantial amounts of meat. The smell of the menageries must have been overwhelming, the sound of caged predators, a constant backdrop. On the day of the games, the animals were driven through underground passages into the arena. Elaborate lifting mechanisms brought them up through trapdoors in the arena floor, a theatrical revelation that awed the crowds. The confused, terrified animals emerged into bright light and roaring noise, confronted by armed men. The hunts were choreographed to some degree, staged to provide maximum spectacle, but the violence was real. The animals died genuine deaths. Blood soaked into the sand that covered the arena floor. The sand itself required constant raking and replacement as it became saturated with blood and other fluids. After the morning animal displays came the executions. At midday, when the elite spectators often left for lunch, convicted criminals were brought into the arena to die. These were not elaborate spectacles, but functional displays of state power. Rome's justice required public death for certain crimes. The arena provided an efficient venue. Some executions were simple. The condemned were brought out, their crimes announced, and they were killed by sword or axe. Others were more theatrical, more cruel. Criminals were sometimes dressed as mythological figures and killed in ways that recreated their stories. A man condemned for murder might be cast as Prometheus and chained to a stake while wild animals tore at him. Another might be made to play Icarus and thrown from a height to crash to the arena floor. These execution spectacles troubled even some Romans. The philosopher Seneca wrote with disgust about the midday executions he witnessed, describing them as murder rather than justice, as degradation of both the executed and the spectators. But his objection was not universal. Many Romans accepted that criminals deserved such deaths, that public execution served as deterrent and as demonstration of the state's power over life and death. The condemned in the arena were society's outcasts, rebels, murderers, arsonists, fugitive slaves recaptured. They had no advocates, no one to speak for them. Their deaths were meant to be degrading, to strip them of dignity, to make them examples. The crowd sometimes jeered, sometimes they were silent, sometimes they felt pity. But the executions continued regardless. After the midday interval, the main event began. The gladiatorial combats. This was what the crowd had come to see, what they had waited for. The gladiators entered in procession, armed and armored, representing different fighting styles. The Murmillo with his fish-crested helmet and large rectangular shield. The Retiarius with his net and trident, fighting nearly naked. The Thracian with his small shield and curved sword. The Secutor pursuing the net fighter with single-minded purpose. The matchups were carefully designed for dramatic effect. Different fighting styles created different tactical situations. The crowd had favorites, fighters they had seen before and admired, or types of gladiator whose style they preferred. Betting was intense. Arguments erupted in the stands over who would win. The fights began. Metal clashed on metal. The crowd roared. The gladiators moved with practiced skill, years of training evident in every motion. This was not random brawling, but technical combat, as refined in its way as any martial art. The best gladiators were athletes, their bodies honed by constant exercise and professional training. But beneath the skill and spectacle was the reality that men were trying to kill each other for the entertainment of the masses. A successful strike, blood flowing, a gladiator stumbling, wounded. The crowd's reaction shifting, some called for mercy, others demanded death. The injured gladiator might appeal to the sponsor of the games or to the crowd, raising a finger in the gesture of submission. The decision of life or death rested with the sponsor, though he often deferred to the crowd's will. If the gladiator had fought well, shown courage, pleased the audience, he might be spared. The wound would be bandaged. He would leave the arena to fight another day. If the crowd was displeased, if his performance had been cowardly or lackluster, the death command came. The victorious gladiator would deliver the killing stroke. The body would be dragged from the arena. The sand would be raked. The next bout would begin. Not all gladiatorial combats ended in death. In fact, most didn't. Gladiators were expensive investments. Their owners, the Lanistae who ran gladiatorial schools, preferred that their fighters survive to earn money in future bouts. The death rate in any given set of games was perhaps 20 to 30%, though this varied considerably based on the type of games and the sponsor's generosity or cruelty. But even surviving gladiators accumulated injuries, broken bones, scars, the brain damage that came from repeated blows to the head. The medical care available to gladiators, though better than most slaves received, could not prevent the long-term consequences of their profession. Many gladiators who survived the arena died young from infections or the delayed effects of injuries. The gladiators themselves came from the lowest ranks of society, slaves purchased specifically for training, criminals condemned to the arena, prisoners of war. Occasionally, free men who volunteered, lured by the possibility of fame and prize money, selling themselves into temporary slavery for the chance to fight. These volunteers were viewed with some contempt by ordinary Romans. Why would a free man choose the degraded status of a gladiator? Yet gladiators could become celebrities. Successful fighters were famous. Their images appeared on lamps, in mosaics, in graffiti. Women of high society sometimes took gladiators as lovers. Scandalized society be damned. The gladiator existed in a strange liminal space, simultaneously degraded and celebrated, slave and star. The training of gladiators took place in special schools, the ludi. These were part prison, part military barracks, part athletic facility. The gladiators lived in cells. They trained for hours each day under the supervision of professional instructors. They ate a diet designed to build muscle and provide energy, heavy on barley and beans. They were property, but valuable property, and were treated accordingly. The psychological toll of this existence is something we can only imagine. To know that you exist to fight and possibly die for others' entertainment. To form friendships with fellow gladiators, then potentially face them in the arena. To survive one bout, then another, knowing that eventually the odds would turn against you. Some gladiators committed suicide rather than continue. Others became hardened, accepting their fate with stoic resignation. The religious dimension of gladiatorial combat connected to its funeral origins. The blood spilled in the arena was an offering. The Romans believed that the shades of the dead required blood to strengthen them in the underworld. The combats honored Mars, the god of war. They demonstrated Roman martial virtue. They reminded the audience that death was always present, that life was fragile, that courage in the face of mortality was the highest virtue. But religious justification coexisted with simple bloodlust. The crowds enjoyed the violence. They cheered the strikes. They shouted advice to the fighters. They groaned at missed opportunities. The spectacle excited them, aroused them, gave them a vicarious experience of life and death struggle from the safety of the stands. The desensitization to violence that the games encouraged troubled some Roman intellectuals. They worried that constant exposure to killing made people indifferent to suffering, that it coarsened moral sensibilities. The Christian writers who later condemned the games focused particularly on this point. How could a society that celebrated such violence claim to be civilized? How could spectators who cheered at death claim to be moral? Yet the games continued for centuries. They were woven too deeply into Roman culture to be easily abandoned. They served too many functions: religious observance, political tool, public entertainment, demonstration of imperial power. The games showed Rome's dominion over the world, bringing exotic animals from distant lands to die in the arena. They showed Rome's justice, executing criminals publicly. They showed Roman martial virtue, celebrating courage and skill in combat. The infrastructure required to stage these spectacles was immense. The amphitheaters themselves, built at enormous expense. The gladiatorial schools, the animal import operations, the weapons manufacturers who supplied gladiatorial equipment, the medical personnel who treated wounded fighters, the undertakers who removed the dead, the cleaners who scrubbed blood from stone and sand. Each festival day featuring games created ripple effects through the economy. Food vendors profited from feeding the crowds. Taverns filled before and after the spectacles. Prostitutes worked the crowds. Gamblers settled their bets. The games generated economic activity even as they consumed lives. The workers in the arena itself, the men who operated the machinery that raised animals through trapdoors, who raked the sand, who dragged away bodies, who cleaned the underground chambers, performed their labor in conditions we would find horrifying. They worked in the smell of blood and death. They handled corpses. They heard the dying screams of animals and men. This was their job, their daily reality. Some of these workers were criminals themselves, serving sentences of hard labor. Others were slaves owned by the state or by the contractors who managed the amphitheaters. They had no choice in their employment. They did what they were told, day after day, festival after festival, growing numb to horrors that would shatter most people. The psychological impact on spectators, particularly children, is something we can only speculate about. Roman children attended the games with their families. They saw animals killed. They saw criminals executed. They saw gladiators bleed and die. This was normalized, part of their education in Roman values. Did it brutalize them? Did some of them have nightmares? We have no records of their inner experiences, only the knowledge that this was considered appropriate viewing for all ages. The contrast between the violence of the games and other aspects of Roman life is striking. The same society that produced Virgil's poetry and Cicero's philosophy also crowded into amphitheaters to watch men kill each other. The same people who performed elaborate religious rituals to maintain cosmic order cheered at public executions. Romans were capable of great sophistication in some areas while accepting brutality in others. This contradiction is not unique to Rome. Many civilizations have compartmentalized violence, finding ways to accept or even celebrate it in certain contexts while condemning it in others. But the Roman example is particularly stark because of the scale and formalization of their violent spectacles, the way they were integrated into the civic and religious calendar as festivals, as celebrations. The gladiatorial games declined slowly. As Rome converted to Christianity, the games came under increasing criticism. Christian emperors began restricting them. The last recorded gladiatorial combat occurred in the early 5th century CE, but the animal hunts continued longer, finally ending in the 6th century as the Western Empire collapsed and the resources to stage such spectacles disappeared. The amphitheaters remain, stone witnesses to what occurred within them. The Colosseum still stands in Rome, one of the city's most visited monuments. Tourists photograph themselves in front of it, walk through its passages, imagine the spectacles that took place there. The violence has been transformed into heritage, the blood into history, the deaths into distant abstractions. But when those festivals occurred, when the amphitheater was filled with living crowds and the arena with dying men and animals, the violence was immediate, visceral, real. The blood was fresh. The screams were heard. The deaths happened in front of tens of thousands of witnesses who had come to see exactly this, who had anticipated it, who found it entertaining or at least acceptable. This is perhaps the darkest aspect of Roman festivals. Not the excess, not the exploitation, but the normalization of death as entertainment. The transformation of killing into spectacle, the collective participation in violence as a form of communal celebration. It reveals something about human nature that makes us uncomfortable. We like to think we are different from the Romans, better than them. But their capacity for violence coexisted with their other accomplishments. They were not monsters. They were people who accepted cruelty as part of their cultural fabric. Let that thought settle as you rest. The cheering crowd, the dying gladiator, the sand soaked with blood, the bodies dragged away. The mechanisms of spectacle requiring such regular feeding with lives, animal and human. This was Roman festival culture at its darkest. This was the cost, measured in suffering and death, of their celebrations. The morning after the games, the arena was cleaned. The blood was scrubbed away, the evidence was removed, but the memories remained, and the anticipation of the next games began. The cycle continued, festival after festival, generation after generation, until finally it ended, leaving only the stones and the stories. The festivals of Rome were never simply celebrations. They were performances of power, carefully orchestrated displays of social hierarchy disguised as communal joy. Every aspect of a festival, from who sat where to who received what, reinforce the fundamental inequalities upon which Roman society rested. Let us examine this mechanism closely, gently. The seating arrangements in the amphitheater and circus were not accidental. They were legislated, formalized by law, enforced by custom, and sometimes by force. The Lex Julia Theatralis, enacted by Augustus, codified what had been informal practice, creating a rigid geography of status visible to anyone who looked at the crowd. Imagine yourself entering the Circus Maximus for the chariot races during the Ludi Romani. You approach the massive structure that stretches along the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills. The entrances are controlled. Guards direct people to different sections based on their social status. Senators enter through private passages leading to the marble seats at the front, closest to the track. Their togas are brilliant white, marking them as the political elite. Their seats have cushions. Slaves stand behind them with parasols to provide shade. The equestrians, the second tier of Roman society, wealthy businessmen and landowners who had not achieved senatorial rank, occupy the next section. Their seats are also marble, though less ornately carved than the senatorial section. They dress in togas with the narrow purple stripe that marks their class. They too have slaves attending them, though perhaps fewer than the senators. Above them, the ordinary citizens fill wooden benches that rise tier upon tier up the hillside. These are the plebeians, the free poor of Rome, the shopkeepers and artisans, the workers and the unemployed who receive grain subsidies from the state. They sit on hard wood for hours. There is no shade. The sun beats down. But they are here, part of the spectacle, included in the communal celebration, even if their inclusion comes with discomfort. Higher still, at the very top where the view is poorest and the sun most punishing, the non-citizens gather, foreigners living in Rome, freed slaves who have not yet achieved full citizenship, women who in earlier periods were excluded entirely from the games, but who by the late Republic were allowed to attend, segregated in the highest sections. Slaves stand wherever they can find space, or they attend their masters, holding parasols, carrying refreshments, running errands. They are present but not participants. They see the spectacle but do not truly experience it as the free citizens do. This spatial arrangement made hierarchy visible. Anyone glancing at the crowd could immediately understand Roman society's structure. The best seats went to those with the most power. Proximity to the action correlated with social status. The festival, ostensibly a celebration that included all Romans, actually demonstrated and reinforced their differences. The distribution of food during festivals followed similar patterns. When sacrificial meat was distributed, citizens received their portions in order of precedence. The wealthy could send slaves to collect their shares, avoiding the crowds and waiting. The poor stood in long lines, sometimes for hours, to receive a few pounds of meat. The portions themselves varied. Citizens of higher status received larger or better cuts. The poorest received whatever remained after those above them had taken their shares. These distributions were called sportulae, little baskets, and they extended beyond meat to include other goods during festivals, oil for lamps, wine in certain instances, sometimes money, small coins thrown to the crowd by generous sponsors. The scramble for these coins revealed the desperation of poverty. Men fought each other for a few bronze coins. The wealthy watched, amused by the spectacle of the poor fighting over their charity. The emperors understood the political utility of festivals with profound clarity. The phrase bread and circuses, attributed to the poet Juvenal, captured this cynically. Keep the masses fed and entertained, and they would not rebel. The grain dole and the games were instruments of social control, mechanisms for maintaining stability in a city crowded with the poor and potentially volatile. But the control operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The festivals celebrated Roman identity, creating a sense of shared community that transcended class divisions. Every citizen, regardless of wealth, was Roman. They worshipped the same gods. They cheered for the same charioteers. They took pride in the same military victories, commemorated in triumphal processions. The festivals manufactured consent, creating emotional attachment to a system that exploited most of those who participated in it. The calendar itself became a tool of imperial propaganda. Augustus reformed the Roman calendar, adding festivals celebrating his family and his achievements. The Ludi Augustalis honored his memory after his death. Subsequent emperors added their own festivals. The calendar filled with celebrations of imperial victories, birthdays of emperors and their relatives, anniversaries of significant events in imperial history. Each new festival required funding. The emperors sometimes paid from the imperial treasury, demonstrating their personal generosity. Other times they pressured or required wealthy senators and equestrians to sponsor games and spectacles as a civic duty. This sponsorship was ruinously expensive, but refusing it was politically dangerous. The wealthy competed to fund ever more lavish displays, bankrupting themselves to maintain their position and please the emperor. This system created a mechanism by which imperial power could extract wealth from the elite, while making it appear voluntary, even glorious. The senator who sponsored magnificent games earned popular acclaim and imperial favor. But he also exhausted his fortune in the process, making him dependent on continued imperial goodwill to maintain his position. The festivals became a means of ensuring that private wealth served public and imperial purposes. For the poor, the festivals provided one of the few opportunities to see and be seen by the emperor. When an emperor attended the games, he sat in a special box, elevated but visible. The crowd could observe him, watching them watch the spectacle. This mutual observation created a kind of relationship, a sense that the emperor cared about the people's entertainment, that he shared their pleasures. Emperors who failed to provide adequate games risked unpopularity. The crowd in the circus or amphitheater was one of the few places where ordinary Romans could express their collective opinion relatively safely. They could cheer or jeer, they could chant demands, they could show favor or displeasure. The smart emperors listened and responded, providing what the crowd wanted, maintaining their popularity through managed generosity. But this apparent responsiveness masked the fundamental reality. The emperors controlled the festivals. They decided what would be celebrated, how lavish the spectacles would be, what messages would be conveyed. The people received what they were given. Their agency extended only to showing approval or disapproval of what was offered, not to determining what would be offered in the first place. The festivals also functioned to mark time and create rhythmic structure in Roman life. The agricultural year, with its seasons of planting and harvest, the military campaigning season that began each spring and ended with autumn, the legal calendar with its days when courts operated and days when they closed, all these were coordinated with the festival calendar. The festivals became temporal markers, organizing time itself according to religious and civic priorities. This organization of time served order and predictability. People knew when to expect festivals. They could plan around them. The rhythms of work and celebration alternated in patterns that, however unequal the benefits might be, at least provided structure and anticipation. Life was not an undifferentiated grind, but a sequence of ordinary days, punctuated by festival celebrations. Yet even this rhythmic quality served the interests of social control. Predictable festivals channeled energy that might otherwise have been directed toward rebellion or resistance into sanctioned forms of celebration. The poor could look forward to the next games, the next distribution, the next moment of inclusion in Roman communal life. This forward-looking anticipation helped maintain social stability. The religious institutions that organized festivals were themselves hierarchical. The priesthoods were held by members of the elite. The pontiffs, the augurs, the flamens who served specific deities all came from senatorial or equestrian families. Religious authority and social authority overlapped completely. Those who interpreted the god's will were the same people who held political and economic power. This concentration of religious authority meant that the festivals served the interests of those who controlled them. The elite decided which gods required honoring, which rituals needed performing, which spectacles would be provided. They framed their decisions in religious terms as obedience to divine will, but the decisions conveniently reinforced their own position. The festivals for Cybele, the great mother goddess, provide a particular example of how Roman festivals could contain genuinely disturbing elements while still functioning as state-sanctioned celebrations. Cybele's priests, the Galli, were eunuchs who had castrated themselves in religious ecstasy. During the festival of Cybele in late March, these priests processed through Rome, dancing wildly, cutting themselves with knives, collecting money from spectators. Most Romans found the Galli disturbing. The self-castration violated Roman masculine ideals. The ecstatic dancing seemed foreign, dangerous, barely controlled. Yet the state had officially imported Cybele's worship during the desperate days of the Second Punic War, following prophetic advice that her presence would ensure Rome's victory. The festival continued even though it made many Romans uncomfortable because religious obligation transcended personal preference. But notice who the Galli were. They were not Roman citizens, or if they had been, they forfeited that status by their castration. Roman law forbade citizens from becoming Galli. The priesthood drew from foreigners, from slaves, from those outside the citizen body. So even this strange, disturbing festival reinforced social boundaries. Romans could watch the spectacle, pay money to the ecstatic priests, honor the goddess without compromising their own status. The ritual otherness of the Galli marked them as separate, as different, as not truly Roman, even though they served a goddess Rome had adopted. This pattern of inclusion through separation appeared throughout Roman festival culture. The foreign gods and goddesses, incorporated into Roman religion, were given festivals, but their worship was often marked as exotic, as different from properly Roman practice. The Egyptian goddess Isis gained popularity in the late Republic and early Empire. Her festivals involved mysteries and elaborate rituals that seemed theatrical and foreign to traditional Romans. Yet she was worshipped widely, her temples built throughout the city. The tolerance for these foreign religious practices coexisted with deep suspicion. The Senate periodically banned foreign cults, tore down their temples, expelled their priests. Then later, the bans would be lifted and the cults would return. The festivals associated with foreign deities existed in a state of precarious acceptance, tolerated when useful, suppressed when they seemed to threaten Roman authority or traditional values. The common people of Rome, the plebeians, had their own relationship with festivals that was complex and sometimes contradictory. The festivals provided entertainment and food, real benefits in lives that often contained little of either. But the festivals also reminded them constantly of their subordinate position. They watched from the cheap seats. They received smaller portions. They were the audience for spectacles that the elite controlled and that sometimes featured the execution or humiliation of people from their own class. Yet they continued to attend. They continued to cheer. They continued to participate in a system that exploited them because the alternatives, rebellion or withdrawal, were dangerous or impossible. The festivals provided one of the few forms of public life available to ordinary Romans. To reject the festivals would have been to reject participation in Roman society itself. The client-patron relationships that structured Roman society were visible in festival seating and participation. Wealthy patrons brought their clients to the games, securing them seats, demonstrating their power to provide access and benefits. The clients were expected to cheer when their patron entered, to applaud his generosity, to show visible gratitude. This performance of dependence was part of the festival experience for many Romans. The patron gained prestige from the size of his client following. A senator with hundreds of clients demonstrated his importance. The clients themselves gained material benefits, seats at games they might not otherwise attend, portions of food from distributions, small gifts of money. But the relationship was fundamentally unequal. The patron could withdraw his favor at will. The client depended on his patron's continued goodwill for access to these benefits. The festivals thus became occasions for the visible performance of these relationships. The hierarchies of Roman society were not abstract but concrete, visible in who sat where, who received what, who attended whom. The social structure was made manifest, reinforced through repetition at festival after festival. Some festivals temporarily inverted these hierarchies, most famously the Saturnalia in December. During this festival honoring Saturn, the god of agriculture and a mythical golden age of equality, masters and slaves exchanged roles briefly. Slaves might recline at the table while their masters served them. They could speak freely, even insultingly, without punishment. Gambling, normally restricted, was permitted. The festivals included gift-giving, particularly of small clay figurines and candles. But notice the limits of this inversion. It lasted only a few days. It occurred within the private household, not in public space. The masters who served their slaves knew the reversal was temporary and theatrical. The slaves knew it too. The Saturnalia provided a release valve for tensions that might otherwise become dangerous, but it did not challenge the fundamental system. If anything, by providing this brief taste of equality, it made the return to normal hierarchy more bearable. After the Saturnalia ended, the usual order resumed. The slaves returned to their duties. The masters reasserted their authority. Life continued as before. The festival had changed nothing structural, though it might have created individual memories of kindness or humanity that made the system more tolerable for those trapped at its bottom. The emperors used festivals to communicate messages to the masses. A particularly lavish set of games announced that the emperor was generous, powerful, concerned with the people's happiness. The triumphal processions that celebrated military victories, often incorporated into festival celebrations, displayed captured enemies and spoils of war, demonstrating Roman military supremacy and the emperor's role as victorious commander. These processions were elaborate propaganda exercises. The conquered peoples were paraded through Rome in chains, dressed in their exotic clothing, carrying their strange weapons. They were exhibited as curiosities, as proof of Roman dominion over the world. Their humiliation was public, intentional, designed to demonstrate that resistance to Rome was futile, that Roman power was irresistible. For the Romans watching, these processions reinforced their identity as conquerors, as the chosen people whose destiny was to rule. For the conquered peoples displayed in the procession, the experience was degrading beyond measure. They had been soldiers or leaders. Now they were exhibition pieces, their defeat made into entertainment, their suffering transformed into spectacle. After the procession, the most important captives were often executed. This was traditional. The triumph culminated in the death of the enemy commander, strangled in the Tullianum, the grim prison at the base of the Capitoline Hill. The body was disposed of without ceremony. The triumph continued with feasting and celebration, the death of the conquered leader marking the complete victory of Rome. These executions, occurring as part of festival celebrations, reveal how thoroughly the Romans integrated violence into their sacred and civic calendar. Death was not separate from celebration, but part of it, a necessary element in the performance of Roman power and piety. The control exercised through festivals was subtle as well as obvious. By providing entertainment and food, the state and the wealthy created dependencies. The urban poor relied on these distributions. They came to expect them. When games were not provided, when the usual festivals were cancelled or diminished, discontent grew. The emperors understood this clearly. Maintaining public order required maintaining the festivals. During times of crisis, when resources were scarce or the treasury was depleted, reducing the scale of festivals was politically dangerous. The emperors and senators had to balance fiscal responsibility against the risk of popular discontent. Usually, they chose to maintain the festivals, borrowing if necessary, extracting resources from the provinces, ensuring that Rome's celebrations continued uninterrupted. This prioritization revealed the festival's true function. They were not optional luxuries, but essential instruments of governance. The games and distributions brought peace in a city that might otherwise have erupted in violence. The crowds that gathered peacefully in the circus to watch races might have gathered as mobs if they had not been provided with spectacle and sustenance. The festivals also created opportunities for the display of imperial clemency. An emperor might pardon condemned criminals during a festival, demonstrating his mercy and magnanimity. He might free gladiators who had fought well, granting them the wooden sword that symbolized manumission. These acts of clemency were carefully staged. They showed the emperor as beneficent, as possessing the power of life and death, and choosing life, at least for some. But clemency exercised as spectacle was still an exercise of power. The emperor's ability to grant mercy depended on his ability to condemn. The freed gladiator owed his life to imperial favor. The crowd witnessed power used apparently benevolently, but the demonstration required that power first be shown in its capacity to harm. Clemency, as festival entertainment, normalized absolute authority while making it seem kindly. The religious aspects of festivals also served control functions. The priests who performed the rituals, who read the auspices, who interpreted signs from the gods, were members of the elite. Their pronouncements carried divine authority. If the omens were unfavorable, military campaigns could be delayed. If the gods were displeased, additional sacrifices and games might be required. Religious authority and political authority were inseparable. This integration meant that challenges to political authority could be framed as challenges to the gods. Disrespect for the emperor, especially after the imperial cult developed, was not just political opposition, but religious impiety. The festivals that celebrated emperors as gods made resistance to imperial power into blasphemy, into offense against the cosmic order itself. The plebeians had their own festivals, celebrations that theoretically belonged to them rather than to the patrician elite. The ludi plebei, the plebeian games, had originated in the struggle between plebeians and patricians centuries earlier. But by the late Republic, these supposedly plebeian festivals were controlled and sponsored by the same elite that controlled everything else. The games had been captured, transformed from expressions of plebeian identity into instruments of elite patronage. This pattern repeated throughout Roman festival culture. Practices that had originated as genuine expressions of popular religion or identity were gradually formalized, controlled, made to serve the purposes of those in power. The spontaneity was choreographed. The communal joy was managed. The apparent inclusion masked continued exclusion. Consider the woman attending a festival, sitting in the highest reaches of the amphitheater or circus. She is free, perhaps even a citizen's wife, but her participation is limited by her gender. She watches the spectacle but does not determine it. She receives whatever portion is allocated to her. Her presence is tolerated but constrained. The festival includes her enough to maintain the appearance of communal celebration while excluding her from any real participation in the power structures that organize the spectacle. Or consider the freedman, the former slave who has earned or purchased his freedom. He attends the festivals as a free man, but his seat is in the sections designated for non-citizens or the lower classes. His former master, if wealthy, reclines on marble in the senatorial section. The freedman has gained legal freedom, but the social stigma of servile origin follows him. The festival seating arrangement reminds him of his permanent subordination, regardless of his legal status. The festivals thus performed social order repeatedly, ritually, making the hierarchy seem natural and inevitable because it was enacted at every celebration, year after year, generation after generation. Children grew up seeing the senators in their fine seats, the slaves standing behind them. They internalized these arrangements as normal, as simply the way things were. The festivals educated each generation in Roman social structure through the repeated demonstration of inequality. The emperors sometimes used festivals to introduce new policies or announce important decisions. The captive audience in the circus or amphitheater provided an opportunity to communicate directly with tens of thousands of Romans simultaneously. An announcement made at the games spread through the city within hours. The festival became a vehicle for information transmission as well as entertainment. But the communication flowed one direction. The emperor or sponsor announced. The people listened and cheered or remained silent. There was no mechanism for dialogue, for the crowd to respond with anything more complex than approval or disapproval. The festivals allowed the illusion of participation while maintaining authoritarian control. Some Romans resisted, though resistance was dangerous and often ineffective. Graffiti scrawled on walls, criticized emperors, or mocked the pretensions of the wealthy. Satire within careful limits allowed criticism disguised as entertainment. But open resistance to the festival system, refusing to attend or participate, marked one as suspicious, as potentially disloyal. The Christians, in the early centuries after Christ, struggled with this issue. Their religion forbade them from participating in pagan sacrifices. Attending the games meant watching gladiatorial combat, which many Christians found morally abhorrent. But refusing to attend marked them as separate from Roman society, as rejecting Roman identity itself. Many Christians compromised, attending some festivals but not others, participating in ways that did not require direct involvement in sacrifice or spectacle. The state viewed Christian refusal to participate in the imperial cult festivals as sedition. The emperors, after all, were gods, or would become gods after death. Refusing to honor them was refusing to acknowledge their authority. This religious disagreement had political consequences. Christians were persecuted not primarily for their beliefs, but for their refusal to perform the public rituals that maintained social order and demonstrated loyalty. Some of those persecuted Christians ended up dying in the arena during festivals, executed as criminals, killed by animals or gladiators while the crowd watched. The spectacle of their deaths was meant to discourage others from rejecting Roman religion and the imperial cult. Yet many Christians embraced martyrdom, seeing death in the arena as witness to their faith, as victory over Rome's power to compel worship of false gods. The festivals continued even as Christianity grew. They adapted, incorporated Christian elements, eventually transformed into Christian holy days. But the patterns of hierarchy, of spectacle-serving power, of controlled celebration, reinforcing social order, these patterns persisted even as the religious content changed. The mechanisms of festival as social control outlived the pagan gods in whose honor they had originally developed. Let yourself rest now with these thoughts. The crowd arranged by status, the emperor watching from his box, the slave standing behind his master's seat, the freedman in the cheap section, the woman relegated to the margins, the foreigner excluded entirely. The festival that appeared to include everyone actually marked each person's place with precision, creating a visible map of social hierarchy. This was the genius and the darkness of Roman festivals. They manufactured consent through spectacle. They created the appearance of generosity while exploiting those who made the generosity possible. They reinforced inequality while celebrating community. They were instruments of control disguised as gifts to the people. And they worked. For centuries they worked. The Roman festival system maintained social order, channeled potentially dangerous energies, created emotional attachment to a fundamentally exploitative system. The people cheered, the elite profited, the slaves served. The cycle continued until the empire itself finally collapsed and the festivals ended, leaving only the architectural shells of amphitheaters and the written records of spectacles we now find both fascinating and disturbing. The Roman festivals ended long ago. The last gladiatorial combat, the final animal hunt, the closing of the amphitheaters all receded into history more than 1,500 years past. The buildings remain, stone witnesses weathered by time. The Colosseum still rises against the Roman sky, though now it shelters cats and tourists rather than hosting death as entertainment. The Circus Maximus is a depression in the earth, a grassy field where Romans jog and walk dogs, where once 150,000 spectators roared at chariot races. But the patterns established by Roman festivals, the mechanisms by which spectacle serves power, the ways celebrations can simultaneously include and exclude, these patterns did not die with the empire. They transformed, adapted, persisted through the centuries in forms we might not immediately recognize as their descendants. Let us trace some of these threads gently, without judgment, simply observing how the past echoes in the present. The medieval tournaments that entertained European nobility borrowed directly from Roman gladiatorial traditions. Knights fought in organized combats, sometimes to the death, while crowds watched from tiered seating. The tournaments celebrated martial valor, reinforced social hierarchy, provided entertainment that mixed genuine danger with pageantry. The echoes of the Roman arena resonated in these medieval spectacles, though the religious and cultural context had changed dramatically. The public executions that continued in Europe until the 19th century, and in some places beyond, carried forward the Roman tradition of death as spectacle. Crowds gathered to watch hangings, beheadings, burnings. The authorities framed these executions as justice, as moral lessons, as necessary demonstrations of state power. The condemned were paraded through streets before their deaths, like captives in a Roman triumph. The execution itself became theater, carefully staged to maximize impact on witnesses. These public deaths served the same functions as Roman arena executions. They demonstrated state power over life and death. They deterred potential criminals through terror. They provided entertainment disguised as moral instruction. The mechanisms were nearly identical despite the passage of centuries and the change in religious context from pagan to Christian society. The bread and circuses model, providing food and entertainment to maintain social order, appeared repeatedly throughout history. Totalitarian regimes in the 20th century understood the formula clearly. Provide basic subsistence and controlled entertainment, and potentially revolutionary energy can be channeled into harmless enthusiasm for state-sponsored spectacles. The massive rallies of fascist states, the May Day parades in communist countries, these were descendants of Roman festival culture, using spectacle to manufacture consent and demonstrate power. Democratic societies use subtler versions of the same mechanisms. Professional sports serve some of the functions that Roman games served. They provide entertainment that captures public attention and emotion. They create shared identity and communal experience. They channel competitive instincts and tribal loyalties into relatively harmless forms. The hierarchies of seating in modern stadiums, from luxury boxes to bleacher seats, echo the status-based seating of Roman amphitheaters. This is not to say that modern sports are identical to gladiatorial combat. The violence is contained, regulated, ostensibly consensual. Athletes are paid professionals, not slaves fighting for their lives. But the underlying pattern, spectacle serving as social adhesive and as distraction from other concerns, that pattern persists. The question of desensitization to violence through media consumption mirrors Roman concerns about the brutalizing effects of the games. We watch violence in films and television, in video games, in news coverage. We debate whether this exposure makes us less sensitive to real suffering, whether it normalizes brutality, whether it coarsens our moral sensibilities. The Romans asked similar questions about the games, though most concluded that the violence was justified by religious and civic necessity. Our justifications differ. We claim artistic expression, entertainment value, freedom of speech. But we still consume violence as spectacle. We still find ways to watch suffering from safe distances. The technology has changed dramatically. The fundamental human fascination with violence and our ability to rationalize watching it, these remain constant. The festival's role in reinforcing social hierarchy also finds modern parallels. Who can afford tickets to major sporting events or concerts? Who sits in the best seats? Who has access to exclusive venues and VIP areas? Modern entertainment events create and display hierarchy just as Roman festivals did. The mechanisms are more commercial, less explicitly political, but they serve similar functions of marking and reinforcing social position. The exploitation of labor that made Roman festivals possible continues in different forms. The workers who build stadiums and arenas, often migrant laborers, paid poorly and housed inadequately. The athletes themselves in some sports, particularly collegiate athletics in the United States, generating enormous revenue while receiving minimal compensation. The entertainment industry's use of unpaid interns and underpaid workers to create the spectacles we consume. The parallels are not exact, but the pattern of hidden labor supporting visible spectacle recurs. The use of festivals and celebrations for political purposes remains common. National holidays that celebrate founding myths and military victories. State ceremonies that demonstrate power and demand loyalty. The careful choreography of political conventions and rallies. These modern political spectacles descend from Roman practices using similar techniques of visual display, emotional manipulation, and manufactured communal experience to serve power's purposes. Even the Roman practice of incorporating conquered peoples into their festivals finds modern equivalents. World's fairs and expositions in the 19th and 20th centuries displayed colonized peoples as exhibits, presenting them as primitive or exotic, using their presence to demonstrate the civilizing mission of empire. The parallels to Roman triumphal processions are disturbing and direct. The religious dimensions of Roman festivals transformed, but did not disappear. Christian holy days incorporated elements of pagan festivals they replaced. Christmas absorbed the timing and some practices of Saturnalia. Easter's date derives from pagan spring festivals. The Church understood that changing beliefs required preserving familiar patterns, that people would more readily accept new religion if it came with familiar celebrations. But notice what changed and what persisted. The Christian festivals eliminated human sacrifice and gladiatorial combat. They condemned the casual cruelty of Roman spectacles. They preached equality before God and the moral worth of every human soul. These were genuine transformations, real improvements in ethical standards. Yet Christian societies still created hierarchies. They still exploited the poor. They still used spectacle for political control. They still found ways to justify violence, whether through crusades, inquisitions, or religious wars. The content of belief changed, but the patterns of power using religion to justify itself and maintain order continued. This is not an argument for moral equivalence across history. Societies can improve, and in many ways they have. Modern democracies, for all their flaws, distribute power more broadly than Roman oligarchy did. Modern ethics, Whatever gaps exist between principles and practice, at least recognize human equality as an ideal. We have abolished slavery, at least formally. We no longer execute people as public entertainment, but the improvement is incomplete, the progress uneven. The patterns established by civilizations like Rome persist in modified forms. The human tendencies that made Roman festivals possible, our capacity for cruelty disguised as celebration, our willingness to exploit others for our entertainment, our ability to not see suffering that serves our pleasure, these remain. Understanding the dark side of Roman festivals helps us recognize these patterns in our own time. It allows us to ask uncomfortable questions about the spectacles we enjoy and the systems that produce them. Who labors invisibly to create our entertainment? Who suffers so that we can celebrate? What hierarchies are being reinforced when we gather for communal experiences? What are we choosing not to see? The Romans were not monsters. They were people who built a remarkable civilization while accepting cruelty as normal, who created beautiful art while tolerating brutal violence, who developed sophisticated law while maintaining slavery. They were complex, contradictory, fully human in their mixture of nobility and barbarity. We are their descendants, culturally, if not always genetically. We inherit their achievements and their moral failures. We live in societies that have improved in some ways while recreating old patterns of exploitation in new forms. Recognizing this inheritance, understanding our connection to the past, this is essential for thinking clearly about the present and the future. The study of history, particularly its darker aspects, serves a purpose beyond simple curiosity. It reveals the depth of human capacity for evil cloaked in celebration, for cruelty disguised as necessity, for exploitation justified by tradition and religion. It shows us that moral progress is neither automatic nor irreversible, that civilizations can be sophisticated and brutal simultaneously, that we must constantly examine our own practices and assumptions rather than assuming we are obviously better than our ancestors. The Roman festivals taught lessons their celebrants did not intend. They demonstrated how spectacle can manufacture consent for unjust systems. They showed how entertainment can distract from oppression. They revealed how religious justification can sanctify cruelty. These lessons remain relevant because the human tendencies they illuminate remain present. But there is also hope in this understanding. If these patterns persist across history, if they appear in different societies and different eras, then they are not inevitable products of specific times or places. They are human tendencies that can be recognized and resisted. We can choose differently. We can create celebrations that do not require exploitation. We can build communities that do not rely on hierarchy enforced through spectacle. We can find ways to gather that honor rather than degrade human dignity. This requires vigilance, though. It requires asking difficult questions about our own celebrations and entertainments. It requires recognizing the labor that supports our leisure. It requires seeing the hierarchies that our spectacles reinforce. It requires acknowledging when we are choosing comfort and entertainment over justice and equality. The Roman festivals were symptoms of a society built on fundamental inequality, on acceptance of slavery, on the belief that some human lives mattered more than others. The festivals both reflected and reinforced these underlying problems. They made inequality visible and normal. They celebrated it even while disguising it as communal joy. Our societies claim different values. We assert human equality, condemn slavery, recognize universal human rights. But we must constantly examine whether our practices match our principles, whether we are truly creating a more just society, or simply finding new ways to disguise old patterns of exploitation and hierarchy. The question is not whether we are as bad as the Romans. Such comparisons are usually unproductive. The question is whether we can recognize in ourselves the same human tendencies that created the dark side of Roman festivals, and whether we can consciously choose to resist those tendencies to build something better. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes, as the saying goes. The patterns recur with variation. Understanding the Roman festivals helps us hear those rhymes, recognize those patterns when they appear in our own context, and perhaps interrupt them before they become normalized as they were in Rome. The physical remnants of Roman festivals stand as monuments and warnings. The Colosseum is beautiful in its way, an architectural marvel, but it is also a monument to mass death as entertainment, to systematic cruelty, to the human capacity for celebrating suffering. Tourism that treats it purely as aesthetic object or historical curiosity misses the moral questions it should provoke. Similarly, we should approach our own spectacular entertainments with clear eyes. Enjoy them if we will, but see them fully, understanding who benefits and who pays the cost, recognizing what hierarchies they reinforce and what they teach us about our values through their very existence. The Roman festivals are distant now, separated from us by centuries and profound cultural changes, but they are not irrelevant. They teach us about human nature, about the mechanisms of power, about the ways spectacle serves purposes beyond mere entertainment. They show us what is possible when cruelty becomes normalized, when exploitation is justified by tradition, when celebration requires victims. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that the civilizations we create, the institutions we build, the celebrations we inherit or invent, these shape us even as we shape them. They teach us what is acceptable, what is normal, what is celebrated. If we want different values, we need different practices. If we want more just societies, we need to examine carefully what our spectacles and celebrations reveal about our actual priorities rather than our stated ideals. Let yourself rest now with these final thoughts. The empty arena, the silent circus, the festivals that ended more than a millennium ago but whose patterns persist, the human capacity for both cruelty and kindness, both exploitation and generosity, both blindness and insight. The question posed to us across the centuries: what will we choose? What patterns will we perpetuate, and which will we break? The Romans made their choices. They created their spectacular festivals with their shadows of suffering. They celebrated their civilization while exploiting millions. They achieved greatness and committed atrocities, often simultaneously, sometimes through the same mechanisms. We face similar choices, different in details, but similar in structure. How we gather, how we celebrate, how we entertain ourselves, these choices reveal our values and shape our societies. The Roman example teaches us to look carefully at what we create, to see both the spectacle and its shadow, to recognize the costs as well as the pleasures. History offers no simple prescriptions, no easy answers, but it offers perspective, context, the accumulated wisdom of previous generations' mistakes and achievements. The dark side of Roman festivals, examined carefully and honestly, becomes a mirror in which we might glimpse our own shadows, our own capacity for celebrating, while others suffer for enjoying spectacles built on exploitation we choose not to see. This is the gift of studying history, particularly its uncomfortable aspects. Not that it makes us feel superior to our ancestors, but that it makes us more conscious of our own choices, more aware of patterns we might otherwise simply accept as natural or inevitable. The Romans created their festivals and lived with their consequences. We create ours and will live with ours. May we choose more wisely. May we create celebrations that honor rather than exploit, that include rather than stratify, that bring genuine joy rather than disguised suffering. This is the challenge the Roman festivals leave us, the question they pose across the centuries. Can we do better? Will we? the night deepens around you. You've journeyed with me through the grandeur and the shadows of Roman festivals, through the spectacle and the suffering, through the celebration and the cruelty. We've stood in the amphitheater seats and in the arena sand. We've watched from the banquet couch and from the slave's position behind it. We've seen both the festival's bright face and its dark underside. Rome is distant now. The festivals are silent. The games have ended. The buildings that housed such spectacles stand empty under modern skies, transformed into monuments and tourist sites, their original purposes almost unimaginable to contemporary sensibilities. Yet the patterns persist. The human tendencies that created those festivals, our capacity for cruelty disguised as celebration, for exploitation justified by tradition, for seeing some human lives as mattering more than others, these remain present even in our very different world. Understanding the darkness in Roman festivals does not require us to condemn the Romans as uniquely evil or to congratulate ourselves on being obviously superior. It requires recognizing our shared humanity, our common capacity for both greatness and moral failure, our ability to create beauty while accepting brutality. The Romans celebrated their gods and their empire through festivals that required immense resources and caused immense suffering. They created spectacles that awed their contemporaries and disturb us still. They built a civilization we still study and admire even as we recoil from aspects of how they lived and what they valued. We inherit this complexity. We live in societies that claim to have learned from history while often repeating its patterns in new forms. We create our own spectacles, our own celebrations, our own ways of gathering that both unite and divide, that both include and exclude. The Roman festivals ended, but the questions they raise remain. How do we celebrate without exploiting? How do we create community without reinforcing hierarchy? How do we entertain ourselves without requiring victims? How do we see clearly the costs of our pleasures and the labor that supports our leisure? These are not simple questions. They admit no easy answers, but they are worth asking, worth contemplating as we move through our own lives in our own time, creating our own patterns of celebration and spectacle. Let the images of Roman festivals fade now into the comfortable darkness of sleep. The roaring crowds, the dying gladiators, the elaborate banquets and the hidden labor, the grand processions and the enslaved porters, the religious devotion and the political manipulation, all of it receding into history, into the past that shaped our present and that we must understand if we are to create a better future. You lie now in safety and comfort that most Romans never knew. No emperor commands your attendance. No crowd demands your death for their entertainment. No system of slavery constrains your freedom. You can rest peacefully, grateful for the genuine progress humanity has made, aware of how far we still have to go. The Roman festivals were grand and terrible, beautiful and brutal, sacred and exploitative. They were fully human in their complexity and contradiction. Understanding them helps us understand ourselves, our societies, our choices. Sleep now. Let history settle into your consciousness not as burden, but as perspective. Not as guilt, but as awareness. The past is past, but its patterns remain relevant. The Romans celebrated their festivals. We must choose what ours will be, rest well in the present, informed by the past, mindful of the future. The night is quiet. The festivals are distant. You are safe. Good night.